Om Parthaya Pradibodhidam Bhagavata Narayanena Swayam Vyasena Grathidam Purana Munina Madhye Mahabharatam Advaidam Radavarshinim Bhagavadim Ashtadashadhyayinim Ambatva Manusandadhami Bhagavad Gita Bhavadveshinim Yam Brahma Varunendra Rudramarudastunnanti Divyaistavaihi Vede Sangapadakramopaniषade Gayanti Yam Samagaha Dhyanavastita Tadgatena Manasa Pashyanti Yam Yogino Yasyandam Navidusura Suraganah Devaya Tasmai Namaha. In the last session, we were discussing a very, very profound idea that gives us an entirely new outlook to life. So we may remember the 29th verse, Yatha pradiptam julanam padanga vishanti nashaya samruddha vegaha tathaiva nashaya vishanti lokaha tavapi vaktrani samruddha vegaha. It's a very interesting exposition of the whole dynamics of human life, especially when we look upon worldly desires as the only goals to be achieved. So, the teacher, Lord Krishna, in this Bhagavad Gita, he compares people who are focused only on empirical worldly pleasures as the only goals in life. They are like moths which are rushing towards a blazing fire. You know, during rainy season, when it starts raining, especially during the early days of rains, you find these fireflies and moths emerge in large numbers. And if you start a fire, if there is a blazing fire, these moths, these insects will fly towards those blazing fire. So those who live in this world without any spiritual outlook, with their eyes focused entirely on momentary worldly pleasures, they are helplessly rushing towards their own destruction, their self-destruction. So the world is a blazing fire. But the same idea changes when we have a spiritual goal to guide our actions and thoughts and deeds. If you can look beyond the momentary, the sensual pleasures, if we can look beyond the empirical things, the fleeting realities, if we can have a higher spiritual ideal, then there is no blazing fire. We are actually moving towards our own spiritual destination. And when we reach this destination, we will realize that the same Atman, the same divine spark exists in all of us. Not in one person, not in one place, but everywhere. And that outlook will help us to see the presence of God not only inside the church or temple or any place of worship, but even outside the place of worship. So that helps us to bring God, even when we bring God into our life, even when we are working outside the temples, when in our everyday activities, when we are in the workplace, when we work in the university, when we are working in the market, wherever we are working, whatever may be a professional job, we can spiritualize our everyday activities. spirituality or the presence of God can be brought into every action, every thought, and the whole life can become a spiritual sacrament. Everything can be spiritualized. So that's a very profound. Yadha pradiptam jwalanam padangaha vishandinashai samrudha vega. There are certain strong words are used. I mean, these insects and these moths are rushing towards the blazing fire with great speed, with great enthusiasm. They don't know they are heading towards their own destruction. So, if we don't have a spiritual goal to guide our life, then every day takes us closer to spiritual destruction. Means spiritually we become empty. Every act takes us closer to the spiritual bankruptcy, spiritual emptiness. At the same time, if we can, this is possible for everyone, whatever may be the tradition you're coming from. All religious traditions are equally valid paths leading to the same goal. That's a fundamental thesis. And not only that, we already said earlier, Yadyat vibhudimasattum simadujidameva tattadeva avagachattum mama tejomsha sambhavam. Lord Krishna says, that's a very essence of this whole entire chapter. He says, wherever you find some excellence, some glory, some greatness, it may be the genius of an artist, it may be the genius of a musician, the genius of a scientist, of the contemplative, meditative nature of a saint, or the selflessness of a man of action, man who is selfless, a saint who is contemplating, a scientist who is achieving a very high degree of perfection in his own chosen field. Wherever you find, you see some kind of excellence, some kind of perfection, some kind of transcendental quality in our everyday work or achievement, that is a spark of the divine present in all of us. When you reach that level of transcendental excellence in art or literature, meditation or mysticism or in philosophy, you are actually connecting with that divine spark that is present in all of us. That divinity within us is manifesting in so many different ways. That is the thesis of this chapter. Yadyat vibhudimas sattum simad ujidameva. Means wherever there is some kind of excellence, something that is sublime, something that is beautiful, that's charming, that's great, grand, the strength of a man who knows how to use his strength. The wealth of a rich man who knows how to use his wealth only for good things and not for bad things. In all these areas, wherever there is an excellence, a sublime quality, that is an expression of the divine, that is present everywhere, that is also present in all of us. And we can achieve this divine, the manifestation of this divinity that's within all of us by practicing karma yoga, jnana yoga, bhakti yoga. Already these explained many times. If whatever we do with a sense of sanctity and sacredness, without selfish attachment. Any activity. If the activity is mixed with unselfishness, total lack of selfishness, it becomes a spiritual act. It becomes a worship. So there is that evolution. At the beginning, we may think we worship in a temple, and outside the temple we work. But as we advance further, we find with the work we do that's outside the temple also is a kind of worship. Worship is not inside a temple alone or in a place of God or church or synagogue or temple. The act of worship can happen in our everyday life, in our everyday activity, in the factory, in the hospital, in the temple, in the university, in the hotel, wherever you work. When we do whatever we do with a sense of sanctity, sacredness, and a degree of non-attachment, means absence of unselfishness, it becomes a sacred act. And we already quoted the example of Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi was not a saint in the ordinary sense of the word that we use in our everyday life. Gandhi was not sitting in a cave or in a mountain or in a monastery or in a cloister. He was mostly he was running a campaign against the foreign rulers, running the streets with people, agitating against foreign colonial rulers. And this man is considered to be one of the greatest men of all times. So how could he practice spirituality, the presence of the divine, even when he was giving a talk to the agitating people who were agitating against a colonial rule? That's because he could bring this element of sanctity, because he did everything without any selfish motive. So there was an element of sanctity and sacredness to whatever he did. This is possible for everyone. There are many, many examples. We already discussed this elaborately, so I won't go further into this. And then we discussed another important thing. We are coming to the end of the chapter. The well-known Kalosmi Logakshekhar Prabhupada, which is what Oppenheimer, I think the great nuclear physicist, quoted when he did the great experiment took place in New Mexico, I think, at the time of atomic explosion. I have become the all-consuming time. This is another interpretation of the divine. Everything happens in that immeasurable, transcendental time concept. So, anyway, that we discussed. Today, we will take up the 48th verse, and then we are coming to the end of this chapter. This chapter ends with some very profound statements about the path of devotion, how to practice devotion. These ideas are relevant and important for all traditions, not only in one religious tradition specifically. So the 48th verse is, na veda yajnai, na adhyanai, na dhanai, na cha kriyabhir, na tapobhirugaihi, evam rupasya aham driloge, dashtum tudanyena guru pravira. The discussion continues. Lord Krishna says, the highest truth cannot be realized just by scholarship, just by reading a number of books, philosophical classics or theological classics. You cannot achieve the highest. You cannot realize it. It's not just believe, that you believe in something, but you realize it. So there's a great difference between believing and realizing. When we realize the presence of the divine, divinity becomes part of our life, our emotions and thoughts and feelings. We can feel the physical presence of the divine. And when such a person realizes this inner divine spark within him or within her, then a transformation comes to him or comes to her. First of all, he feels a kind of inner fulfillment and happiness and contentment within. And that also makes him broad-minded. That makes him a better human being in his interactions with others. It makes him a better human being. It makes him more broad-minded, more tolerant, more universal in his outlook. And when you reach that stage, you can see God in everyone and see everything in God. That is the ultimate goal of this spiritual evolution. I already quoted this in one of the earlier classics, Bhagavad Purana. It is said, Sarva bhudeshu yapashyed bhagavad bhavam atmanaha bhudani bhagavadi atmani esha bhagavatottamaha. It's a very interesting discussion, a dialogue between a great philosopher king Almost like the philosopher king concept that you find in Plato's Republic. And 9 sages. 9 sages' names are mentioned. Kavir, Havir, Andariksha, Prabhuddha, Pipalayana, Avi, Hotrotha, Dumilas, Chamasa, Karabhajana. You find in the 11th section, 11th book of the Bhagavad Purana. It's an interesting dialogue between a great philosopher king and 9 sages. So one question that this king puts those sages is this: who is a real spiritual person? In the sense, who is a truly religious person. True religion is spirituality, not just faith or ritualism. So who is a really religious spiritual person? You may expect an answer. Somebody who reads a sacred book every day, he goes to the temple every day, who may go to a church or attend programs in a church or a place of worship or temple. No. The answer is one who sees the presence of God in everyone and one who experiences the presence of everything in God. It's a kind of seeing all in one and seeing one in all. This is the highest level of spiritual experience. And not just by scholarship, by philosophical or theological discussions. Theology, philosophy, mysticism, mystical works are very important, very useful, but they alone cannot give us to this level of experience. Philosophy can give us a number of great ideas, good ideas. And also, if you read Plato's Republic or Aristotle, or Shankaracharya's books, so if you read the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, or if you read Master Eckhart, any of these great theologians, it's very interesting reading. It takes our mind away from this world of empirical things. We can take our level of awareness, our mind, to some higher level of contemplation and so on. So philosophy is very helpful. Mysticism is very helpful. If you read Emerson, Thoreau, or Whitman, if you read Walden, nothing but just Henry Thoreau's movement, travels through forests, ponds and rivers, seeing clouds and skies. That's all. Nothing specific. But that alone can take your mind away from the everyday empirical sensual things and keep the mind a higher level to think and contemplate. So in that sense, mysticism, philosophy, theology, they do have their place. They do have the significance, but they alone cannot be a substitute for our own spiritual experience. That's the real implication of this statement in the 48th verse, and in the 51st verse you can find Arjuna asks Lord Krishna to show him his real normal human form, not the cosmic universal form, but this real human form. And the Lord Krishna came down and he gives a final statement at the end of the 11th chapter, that is the 55th verse. He says, Mat karma krit, mat paramo, mat bhakta sangavarjidaha, nirvaira sarvabhudeshu, yassa mameti pandava. This is the 55th verse of the 11th chapter. It says, you should become mat karma krita. I mean, doing whatever you do as an offering to the Lord, thinking of the Lord in mind, then every action becomes a worship. Otherwise, even worship can become just an action. So these are two different approaches, Even for a priest, the act of worship can become just a mere job, an action, just a duty. On the other hand, a person working in the restaurant, in the hotel, in the army, even law enforcement, which are not necessarily religious places, even that duty can become an act of worship. So it is not action alone that decides what kind of action it is. It is the attitude, the mind behind action that gives a specific quality. So the last verse is a great message, the message of this chapter. What a spiritual man should be like, how he should interact with others, and how he should interact with himself. What should be his approach while doing his secular activities? That's a very important thing, not just while meditating or reading sacred books or doing sacrament or worship. No. How he should act even when he is not inside a church or a temple or a place of worship. What he should be like right in the field of action. So he says, Mat karma krita. He should do everything as an act of worship. At the beginning of our spiritual evolution, this may not be so very easy. At the beginning of our life, we may meditate for 2 hours, maybe 1 hour a day, every day morning. We may go to church or a temple once a week or twice a week perhaps. So we have specific days and time when we dedicate, that we spend for spiritual activities. Just a few hours a week perhaps. So these few hours are meant for spiritual activities and the rest for secular activities. So we draw a line of demarcation between the secular and spiritual. So worship and work. Then all work can be done as an act of worship. When we do everything with a sense of sanctity, sacredness, and also with a sense of detachment. Detachment means free from any kind of obsessive attachment. When there is nothing wrong in having positive attachment. But attachment can become a negative quality when it becomes an obsession, when it becomes a kind of fanatical obsession. That can be a problem. So if a person can do his everyday secular activities with a sense of sanctity and sacredness, without obsessive attachment to the results of his actions, we should certainly make sure that our actions do produce the expected result. That's important. But there is a stage when we become mentally and spiritually enslaved by what we do. When we are always anxious about the results of what we are doing, to the point of becoming fanatically thoughtful or anxious. We can have anxiety neurosis. It can be a psychological problem even. That creates a lot of problems in modern business world. When we worry too much about what is going to happen, the results of our actions. Now, that can be solved, that problem can be solved if we can become less obsessed, or if we can be non-obsessed. We should take interest, but should not be obsessed. Then what happens? Every action becomes an act of worship. So from the stage where action or work and worship, we come to a stage where work is done as worship. And finally, everything becomes worship. So whole secular life also can be spiritual. Then mat parama. This is an important term. These are the certain technical terms used in the 55th verse. Means a person who considers God as the only supreme goal in life. When we talk about God, we should remember the God idea is a universal concept. It's not God of one religion or one sect of people. The divine spark that is present in everyone and is present in every one of us. When we realize that, we look upon the whole humanity as one spiritual family. Even those who do not believe in God can be members of the spiritual family. So that is the highest goal. And of course, there is a term that comes along with this in the next word, Madbhakta. In Vedantic tradition, there is a kind of evolution in the idea of worship. It's an interesting thing. So, one of the great Vaishnava philosophers, Ramanujacharya, he defined the highest devotion as prapatti. That's a technical term used in Sanskrit. It means somebody who has self-surrendered, who has surrendered himself to God. When we surrender, what happens? Even psychologically, it is very, very helpful. It's just like, we suppose there is a huge weight that we are bearing on your head. Suppose there is 1 millimeter gap between our head and the weight, we won't feel the burden, the weight. And sometimes what happens, in our mind, in our memories, we carry a lot of past impressions from previous life cycles. All thoughts and worries and anxieties, which do not have any significance or relevance at present, but still we carry them. It's just like taking pieces of stone from the street, a big, huge bundle of heavy stones from the street you carry on your head. We can easily throw away all this. So, this is one problem. So, all these can be got rid of. These past memories, the burden of the previous life cycles. Vedanta believes in the idea of multiple lives, life cycles. Whatever we do in this life, it will create a samskara or an impression which will influence our mind, and many of our worries and thoughts and actions could not be traced to our previous happenings in this life. So they are coming from another source. So Vedanta, Yoga, Buddhism, all these religious traditions will tell you they're coming from previous life cycles. So like that, we are carrying a lot of heavy load of impressions and memories. All these can be got rid of through this process of sublimation. So, and this is possible by becoming a true devotee, and such a devotee is called prapatti, means complete self-surrender. You feel a heavy load is taken off your shoulders. Suddenly we feel we are just carrying stones and pieces of useless things as a big burden. We could not walk. Suddenly we can just disown all this. That's what happens when a person becomes a prapanna. So that's where Ramanuja defines Anugulisya sankalpaha pradigulisya varjanam rakshasridhi vishwasa goptrutta varanam tadha Atman nikshepa karparne shadvidha sharanagati. Ramanujacharya was a great Vaishnava philosopher who lived in the 12th century, 11th, 12th century AD. He says one should always have positive impressions and thoughts, and one should try to avoid negative thought currents. One should have a sense of feeling that God is our ultimate protector, and a kind of self-surrender, surrendering ourselves, offering ourselves. Surprisingly, you can find all these ideas so elaborately described in the lives of St. John of the Cross, and much more elaborately in the autobiographical writings of St. Teresa of Avila. You can find the inner castle or concept of going deeper and deeper into our own essence. So all these ideas are being given a great spiritual interpretation in the ancient scriptures of Vedanta or Hinduism. So mat karma kurt, mat parama, mat bhakta sangha varjita. And sangha varjita means without any obsessive attachment. This should be very clearly understood. Sometimes we may think that attachment is something very good in the human relations and very much necessary. But there is a kind of attachment which can become a negative force. It can become a prison wall sometimes. When we become obsessed with certain things to the point of being spiritually and psychologically enslaved by certain ideas. At that time we should be able to practice non-attachment. This is very important. And also, looking upon the entire humanity as one spiritual family. There is no line of demarcation. There is no boundaries of culture, race, religion, caste, or whatever it is, or anything. The entire humanity is one spiritual family. That's Nirvaira, Sarvabhuteshu, having no enemy anywhere. That's the idea behind. So, Nirvaira Sarvabhuteshu Yasamamedis Pandava. Only such a person who looks upon the entire humanity as one spiritual family and looks upon, in fact, there are other verses which says not entire creation. In some of the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam you can find and the whole earth is one family. There's an ancient concept. There are certain verses in the ancient scriptures which will talk about looking upon entire creation, not just human beings. Even the mountains and valleys and clouds and rivers, they also are sacred. Because if you pollute water and air and if you go on digging, taking for minerals, going in search of coal, it can actually create a kind of imbalance the geographical structure, the geological structure, which can threaten human life. So, even nature, the empirical nature is sacred in the sense, if you violate its balance, it can affect human life, it can become an injury, it can become a harm, something that does harm to humanity. It can do a lot of harm to human life. So the whole creation is one single spiritual entity. That idea is very strongly put forward in this 55th verse. Nirvaira Sarvabhuteshu. You should not look upon anyone as your enemy, anyone as other than yourself. The idea behind. That's why Vedanta scriptures will talk about this dharma, satyam and rutam. These three principles which are brought out here by some commentators. Dharma is the regulating principle, ethical and moral philosophy that should guide our life. Dharma, the Sanskrit word comes from a root called dhr, means that it preserves, sustains, supports, protects. That's the meaning of dharma. So something that preserves the equilibrium, the sanctity, the balance of nature and life in this world. That's the meaning of dharma, which Buddha elevated to a higher philosophy of ethics and morality and a great religious doctrine. That is dharma. Satya actually is truth. Truth in the true sense, when we keep our mind and thought, so my mind and word and act, what we think, what we speak and what we do, all in one line, all the same, that is truthfulness. Rhythm is the invisible balancing order, the balancing structure. Means it's just like, some of the commentators make some very interesting descriptions and examples. So he says, you may have heard this Vedic statement, that is, let there be sweetness and harmony in earth, waters, heavens, skies, mountains, and so on. You find Dev Prithivir Antariksham, Dev Shanti Antariksham Shanti, Prithvi Shanti, Osadaya Shanti, Vanaspadaya Shanti. It's an ancient Vedic verse. Let there be peace and harmony in the oceans, in the waters, in the clouds, in the sky, everywhere, and also in human hearts. Now, if you do something and that disturbs this inherent peaceful harmony of existence and creation, that is against the principle of dharma, because that is against the rhythm. So rhythm is the invisible balancing structure, the invisible balancing divine reality behind everything. So when you do something that disturbs the harmony of nature, harmony of life, then it is against rhythm, against dharma, against satya. So these three ideas are brought out in this context. A person who follows the path of rhythm, satyam, and dharma alone can be a truly spiritual person. So spirituality is far beyond worshipping a god in a temple or a place of worship. That is good, that is important. But spirituality is actually looking upon entire existence, creation as one spiritual family, and looking upon everything, every act as an act of worship. So this is the final word conclusion of this important chapter. In this chapter there are many interesting verses. In one context, Lord Krishna says, which actually is a prelude to the next chapter, 12th chapter. Bhaktya tu ananyaya shakya aham evam vidhorjuna jnadum drashtum cha tattvena praveshtum cha parandava. That is 54th verse. Towards the conclusion. Just before conclusion. Without true devotion, you cannot, single-minded devotion, you cannot actually see this divine cosmic form. And without this, you cannot know the true reality. And you cannot get the true nature of this divine reality. With true devotion. What's the true devotion? That will be discussed in the coming chapter. So what is devotion? Devotion is not just a profession of faith. Profession of faith certainly is important, it's relevant, it is certainly a part of spiritual life, but true devotion in its highest state is looking upon the entire creation as one spiritual family, connecting with and realizing the presence of the divine spark in everyone and in everything, and looking upon entire creation as one spiritual family. After this, we will do the next chapter in the coming session. We can have interactions. You are most welcome to ask questions. Many of the ideas may be new to, so most welcome. We'll have interaction for about 15 minutes.
Swamiji, you mentioned that a lot of people who kind of reach the pinnacle of the success in their own fields, it's sort of divine manifesting itself. A lot of these people are also known to have very obsessive personalities that are really allows them to get to that level. How do you make sense of that? Like, is that,
yeah?
How do you sort of get to that success?
That's true. In the earlier chapter, in the 10th chapter, and also in the earlier part of this chapter, you may have seen Belam Belavadam Chaham Kamarag Vivarjidam, you can find. That means strength of a strong man. He is very spiritual, very peaceful, very non-violent. The wealth of a rich man who is very charitable, very generous. Knowledge of a scholar who is very humble. So you can find these two aspects. On the one hand, you can find some kind of sublime quality, excellence, perfection. On the other hand, you find a balancing quality. See the generosity, the humility of a rich man, and the humility and let us say discerning wisdom of a strong man. So you can find all this. So that's why wherever you find this excellence, then only becomes excellence. Brute strength or brute haughty knowledge, it doesn't translate into spirituality. Again, what Lord Krishna says is, It is a manifestation of this divine spark within you. Suppose a person really works hard and becomes great in some respects, but he also knows the limitation of his achievements, which makes him humble. That's an important thing. You should have all these, but you should know the limitation of what you have. That latter quality many people don't have because they don't connect with the presence of the divinity within them. When you connect with it, immediately you understand you are just one insignificant speck in this mighty universe. If you think of the solar system, the galaxies, and then Earth itself is a tiny, very insignificant thing. And this 8 billion people, we are one of them. So the point, even it is possible even for a great physicist. There were many physicists who were also great thinkers. They didn't become thinkers because they studied Shankaracharya or Aristotle or Kant or Hegel or Plato. But if you reach excellence in their own chosen field with all sincerity, then you connect with some universal wisdom, and that makes them philosophers. So very often, students of philosophers, academic philosophers are not necessarily philosophers in life. An important thing. Many academic philosophers are sometimes extremely, without offense, extremely unphilosophical, very, very childish. But many people who are not formally students or teachers of philosophy are very philosophical, very profound in their judgment, in their understanding of things. So philosophy in the higher sense, is a love of knowledge. In the higher sense, a quest for true knowledge, not intellectual book knowledge, but higher wisdom. So that wisdom, which you can use capital letter W for that. That wisdom is a spark of the divine within us. That's what Lord Krishna says. There are in all these previous verses, the 10th chapter and 11th chapter you find. All these examples are given. Examples of those who are distinguished in certain specific areas to the perfection and the sublime achievement. Beyond the limit, you cross the barriers and you reach a transcendental level. There you're connecting with your own divine spark within us. That's the idea. So, yeah, please.
Swamiji, you mentioned that there should not be any demarcation between the spiritual world and the secular world.
Yeah.
But if we go in the secular world and act very selflessly, there is a chance that someone will take advantage of that, because taking a job, if you work very selflessly, then somebody will make harass you or take advantage of earning more money. So how do you keep sincerity with yourself and at the same time not get harassed?
Yeah, spirituality should not make us indifferent or incompetent or inefficient or incapable of facing challenges or problems. But we should have all these, we should strive to get all these qualities to succeed. But then, once you understand even the highest success in the empirical material world cannot actually give us permanent contentment or satisfaction. From that realization of the limitation of so-called success, you get a kind of wisdom. So that wisdom can come to a great artist, great scientist, great architect. In any field, when you reach a very high level of perfection, then you actually realize the limitation of your perfection. And that's a point where you connect with the transcendental. And Lord Krishna says that ability to understand the limitation of all that you achieved is an expression of the divine spark within all of us. That's the idea behind. So you can find even secular life can be spiritualized with this attitude. Buddhist perspective. That's the idea. If still time. So I conclude now. We will have the next chapter in the coming session. Om Tatsadi Srimad Bhagavad Gita Su Upanishatsu Brahma Vidyayam Yoga Shastre Sri Krishna Arjuna Samvade Vishwarupa Darshana Yogo Nama Ekadashodhyaya. This is the end of the 11th chapter. In the 12th chapter, we will have long discussions on the path of devotion, Bhakti Yoga. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Sri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu